Good morning. I guess we'll be starting. We are missing one of the speakers this morning, but I'm hoping you will be coming soon. And I'm hoping that everybody can see the slides. Unfortunately, I cannot see. If somebody says, just scream if you cannot see the slides. So this morning, the CEM Dialogue, welcome to it. And what we wanted to talk is about the issue of governance and resilience and the relationship within adaptive systems and the absence of regulatory policy needed to stop degradation. And what we met, it's a big title, and what we met is pretty much how do we deal with the challenges that we may have a lot of different international agreements, conventions, etc. But how do we really get them to a level that really brings the issue of resilience and governance and adaptive system into play and see how it really can work very well for future policies or action that we want to make sure. So ideally, Mike Jones was supposed to be presenting first, and I was going to present second, but I guess we'll inverse the role until he can join us. I'm not completely sure what is happening. So just to start a little bit, I wanted to first remind people that we have several convention agreements and even more. If I look at, first of all, the United Nations, we have the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals. And this really is really merging a lot of efforts, not only from the UN perspective, but all the affiliated organization, that is the UNESCO, for example, so the United Nations Educational, Scientific, Cultural Organization, or even IUCN. So everybody is really under the same umbrella in terms of trying to achieve or to contribute to the goals. Within the UN, we also have the Framework on Climate Change Convention, and we have also many more. When you look at the pages of the UN, for example, and even with UNESCO, we're talking about over 500 convention treaties and agreements that exist. And they are from different levels. They can be from social rights, social justice, journalism, but many of them are related to the environment. And they are not necessarily just at the United Nations directly. Even if we use to the climate change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Bond Challenge, a lot of these ones. There are also others that are, for example, with UNESCO, such as the Man and Biosphere, which is for the Biosphere Reserve. And the other one that often is forgotten is the RenzoSITEs. It is at UNESCO, but it is managed by IUCN. So this makes that for the general public in general, it's quite complex when we look at all these things. And we're trying to figure out about what do they mean really for local communities, and in many cases who are not aware of these different convention treaties or agreements. So today I wanted to just give a case study of the RenzoSITEs. The RenzoSITEs are, as I mentioned, it's part of a convention, and it's one that often is forgotten, but at the same time, the main goal of RenzoSITEs are the wise use, and especially related to the conservation of wetlands. And when we talk about wetlands, we're not talking just the area where you have vegetation and wetlands the real way, but it's include any type of wet space land. So it can be mangroves, it can be even rivers or shoreline or coastal areas. So it's quite variable. It's more complex than just looking at wetlands the strict way that often people think about when we look at Ramsar site. This is a convention that has a quite a large number of members, 171 member nations. There are over 25 million hectares in 2,300 sites that are under protection in some way or another. They are, if you think about it, the largest network of globally important areas in terms of protecting these wetlands. So all these aquatic, if you want, or semi-aquatic environment. One thing that is important to realize is that most conventions, in fact, pretty much all, are voluntary. So that means that they are signed by countries, but they don't necessarily have a legal aspect. And you know, in the case of Ramsar, we're talking about the global biodiversity recognition of wetlands. And just a few examples, Alone Bay, for example, or in our case here in Canada, we have many of them, like the Blue Lake, which are very specific place where you have unique biodiversity, unique ecosystems. And the approach of Ramsar is really to strengthen the environment globally through these conservation measures. What I wanted to talk about, and this is why it would have been better to have the theory before probably, is that we have done in Canada an analysis of the different Canadian Ramsar sites, and that was with one of my master's students, Jocelyn Baker, who examined the 37 current Ramsar sites that we have and looked at the issue of sustainability, governance, in a view also of resilience and adaptation. Adaptation not only to climate change, but any type of either development or environmental changes. So we have a map here of the different Ramsar sites that we have in Canada, and it goes pretty much from the Arctic to southern Ontario, and some are very popular, like Pili Islands, for example, or Long Point, which are also migratory bird sanctuaries. Some are more controversial and are not necessarily as obvious in terms of protection, because they are very close in some cases of big cities like Mer Bleue. So the elements that were analyzed in this is, first of all, who are involved in the Canadian Ramsar sites. Are we talking only government, or are we talking communities? What is the relationship between both aspects, or even NGOs? How does it work in terms of governance issues? The second was also to look at how Canadian are managed. Do they have a management plan, which is quite important in many cases to know how they are dealing with possible development pressure, because in some cases they are close to urban centers. What activities do they promote? Do they promote conservation and or restoration? Because this is part of the priorities of the Ramsar site. Do Canadian Ramsar site have a reporting structure, and what is it? And finally, how do they communicate these conservation efforts that they do in their wetlands? And again, this was something that we were quite concerned when we started doing the analysis, and you'll see gradually why. So the analysis was based, as I mentioned, on governance and sustainability, with the idea that with environmental and climate changes, we know that we have to enhance the resilience of these ecosystems, and we have to figure out how this can be happening. So what you looked at is really how ecosystem governance may be supporting environmental sustainability, and gradually resilience of these Ramsar sites. So we use the convention and the newest priority plan, strategic plan for the Ramsar site, which has 3 criteria. The first one is called the wise use, and there are priority focus that exists for that. The second is the criterion 2, which is effective management. There are 4 other focus priorities on this case, and the criterion 3, and hence cooperation, as 3 of them. So we use 12 of the 14 priorities of the convention. And that include, for example, preventing degradation, climate change, invasive species, ecosystem services, and this is more related to number 1 and 2, and cooperation, effective participation, and financing, for example, are related to the criterion number 3. So her approach, or if you want the background behind that, is going to look at, are some Ramsar sites only governed by governments, and that's it? Or do we have some that have a bigger, more integrative approach with the local communities, with NGOs, and at that point will lead more towards ecosystem resilience and ecosystem governance and adaptive management at that level, since there would be more implication of the population, local, especially communities. So these are just some of the results that we looked at in terms of what happened in these sites. There are 37 sites, as I mentioned. When we look at, and I should say each focus priorities were assessed, and there were a score for a total of 30 in total. And as you can see here, when we made the average, 14 sites scored over 75%. So for us, 75% was what we could say Ramsar sites that are have a management plan usually. In fact, most of them had, except one. Usually they have quite a good idea of conservation activities and restoration. They are looking at sustainability and ecosystem governance and have a certain level of participation of the population. When we look at the next, we have 15 sites that were between 51 and 75%. Most of them didn't have a management plan. Most of them didn't necessarily report. Most of them were also mostly governmental with very little interaction with the local communities. And finally, we had 8 sites that were purely governmental with no interaction with the community, had no management plan, had no reporting, and pretty much didn't have necessarily a lot of, I would say, conservation or restoration activities. They were pretty low. And you can see on the graph, when we separate these different 3 categories of performance, if you want, of the Ramsar sites in terms of sustainability. If you look at the highest level, usually the 3 components, so wise use, effective management, and enhanced cooperation were all very high. When we look at the middle sites, all of them decided this were lower in terms of capacity of sustainability. And when we look at the one that were below 50%, in many cases, the wide use is in fact the lowest level, and followed by effective management and enhanced cooperation. So we can see that depending on where the sites are, but also how they are managed, they may not necessarily have any capacity in terms of ecosystem governance, sustainability, and certainly this may question the possibility of resilience of these sites, especially when we look in environmental and climate changes, especially for those sites that are more in either in the northern component of Canada, as well as close to urban centers. So one thing that came up very quickly with the discussion related to the Ramsar designation is that that will not necessarily ensure environmental protection. So even if we have a convention, even if it's supposed to really bring, you know, as much as possible conservation, unfortunately, this is not the case. And so it will not necessarily also bring regulation in most countries. Some countries will use the Ramsar site to bring regulation, but it's not the opposite. It's not also restricting users' right, which in some cases, when we look at indigenous people, this may be good. However, the problem, and we have one case in Alberta where one of the wetland is threatened because of oil exploitation, and also the national park wanting to have, for example, choppers passing over when we have the white crane as one of the species at risk there. So there are many conflicts at that point that exist, and without having a good sense of the governance, the issue of sustainability and resilience become very complicated. The Ramsar sites are voluntary and are using a voluntary framework, and also they don't prevent economic development projects. So this means that when they're closed, for example, to urban centers, they may be threatened gradually. And this has caused a lot of issues over time. Because in some cases, and we had a case here in Canada, where they wanted to use the biodiversity of setting to say, oh, we can transfer the wetland in another place so that we can make a new residential development here. So these are issues also that can bring a lot of challenges for designations that want to be aimed at protecting and conserving biodiversity. And we know very well that wetlands are, in terms of ecosystem services, very important in terms of filtration, water control, flooding control, etc. So these are the issues that are certainly not helping too much. So where are we going from there? One thing that we have realized, even in Canada, the last Ramsar site was designated a few decades ago. We are trying to put the Niagara River as a Ramsar site right now. And there's really a lack of political will in these aspects, especially when you're close to places where they could be urban or tourism development. It's kind of interesting because it's a transboundary, potentially, Ramsar site. The United States already has designated, in their case, in 2018, the Ramsar site. So there was no problem on their side, but there is in our case here. The other component, and this is one thing that we wanted to discuss, and especially if we had also the other component with Mike, is that academics mainly continue to promote the concept of resilience, inclusive and adaptive governance. But when we look at, for example, these Ramsar sites, what we look at it is that it's not necessarily the case, especially in terms of inclusive and adaptive governance and management. So this reduces at that point the capacity of these sites to be better protected, but also the question of with environmental and climate changes, are they going to be sustainable and resilient in the long term? So the two big questions that we had in terms of the debate today that we wanted to start and also bring all the participants here is to discuss how can governments and large corporations be convinced of these approaches. So the question of resilience, governance, being adaptive management, but as a conservation organization and what we are doing, are we capable of changing the system? because this is a big point that we face. And this came from the discussion that some of us have had, that, you know, if we look at the Aichi target, for example, most of them, if not all, have not been achieved. We see the same with the Millennium Development Goal. And we know very well right now, especially because of COVID, that the SDGs most likely will not be achieved as well. So we're very good at putting a lot of convention agreements, treaties. How do we make it change the system that it can transform to something that is more productive at the long term in terms of reducing the impact of humans on on nature? So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing, and hopefully Mike is there. Yay! Good to see you, Mike.
Hi, I'm really sorry. I think the time zone, or we changed to summertime over the weekend, and my schedule did not pick that up.
Yeah, that's a problem. I have the feeling that it didn't help.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm here, and having listened to at least the last half of your presentation, I'll try and spin some of mine so that it responds directly to some of the issues that you raised.
Perfect. Do you want me to share the screen? That will be.
Yeah, I think just throw it up, and we'll step through the slides one by one. But I'll try and modify what I was going to say.
Great, go for it.
Can I control that from here?
I'm not sure. No, you may have to let me just say next.
You're going to have to move me to the first slide. Okay, so this first slide, it's about a metaphor that we use for guiding systems thinking about ecosystem governance. So, and I've highlighted governance right there in the middle of the slide. And governance is all about the policies and the laws and the informal rules that people use to help them to decide how to use an ecosystem such as a Ramsar wetland, for example. But the point about this iceberg metaphor is that what it does is it allows us to dive into the deep underlying causalities of things that are going wrong with regard to biodiversity conservation. So at the top of the iceberg, we have these events like epidemics and pandemics and species extinction. And these are all things that people react to, short-term solutions, but don't really address the problem. It's like putting a Band-Aid on an arterial wound. And so we need to understand much more about what underlies these events, and then think more deeply about what we need to start conserving biodiversity and stopping the degradation that's happening at an ever-increasing rate. So from the events and the reactions, then we get to the study of patterns and trends, which allows us to make some forecasts about what might be happening in the future. But then we get down into the design of the system, and it's the design of the system that is what enables these trends to emerge and what enables these events to happen. But then we need to get down below that as well to the mental models. And that is, what are the beliefs and values do people hold, and how do these maintain the system? How do they influence the design of the system, keep it locked into the state that it's in? And we need to understand those mental models if we are going to transform systems. One of the things that we have that really doesn't do conservation, biodiversity conservation, any favors at all at the moment is this dominant Western worldview that's based on things like economism, neoliberalism, so on. It's all to do with market-based capitalism. And these funny thoughts that people have about the ability to maintain economic growth and decouple that growth from the environment, maintain economic growth. And it doesn't matter if we destroy nature, we can replace nature with technology and human ingenuity. So these are some of the really strong beliefs that a lot of people in Western societies, and also to a fairly large extent now in industrial societies in the East, these are things that they hold very dearly. And it doesn't matter what the evidence might be to the contrary, they can't see it because they're actually blinded by these beliefs. It affects their cognitive abilities, their abilities to see change and to understand change. So, and just, just thinking about this Ramsar Convention, the fact that it's a voluntary framework with no real teeth to it to regulate use of resources, that kind of thing, United Nations organizations can develop these soft laws and soft rules, but nations aren't bound to do anything with regard to enforcing them. So at a high level, there is no control at all. The control comes down to the national level, and then it very much depends on what other governments' policies with regard to things like wetlands. And if governments don't recognize that wetlands are actually really important for society, for industry, for commerce, because of the water that they produce and control and regulate, and the greenhouse gas emissions that they're involved with, if governments don't recognize that as essential to maintaining the economy, then they're not going to develop the right kind of policy and legislation. So let's move on from there to the next slide. I'm just going to illustrate feedback, just a very simple feedback. And complex systems operate on feedback, and understand complexity and how things can go badly wrong or badly right, if that's the right way of saying it. Within a system, you need to understand feedback. And this top model here is just a very simple pair of reinforcing loops, which show how economic growth leads to allocation of biodiversity to the economy, which leads to economic activity, which leads to more economic growth. So that is a reinforcing loop which grows the economy at the expense of biodiversity. And then on the opposite side, on the right-hand side there, you've got, as the allocation of biodiversity goes to the economy, then ecosystem processes start to break up, ecosystem health declines, and that is a reinforcing leap that actually takes ecosystems into decline. And if you keep that going long enough, then you have wholesale collapse of ecosystems and biodiversity. So the way to stop it, once you understand this model, is just to change the way in which biodiversity is allocated to the economy. Less biodiversity to the economy, reduce economic activity, put a cap on economic growth, and that would allow ecosystems the time, the space that they need to start recovering. And then the bottom graph just shows what happens over time. So you see an exponential economic growth, an exponential ecosystem decline. And it's important to understand the exponential nature of this, because what it means is that the future is coming at us faster and faster. We are in exponential growth, we are in exponential decline. And if we don't stop it, if we continue going down the economic growth road, what we're doing is we're just pressing on the accelerator, even though there is a major accident about to happen. It's once you understand things like feedback and understand how these systems interact with each other, then it's very easy to see that we've got some major problems. And it's actually not that difficult. I mean, it's not easy, but it's not that difficult to change them. But if people can't see it because of their beliefs about endless economic growth and nature being a continuous and endless source of supply of the goods and services that are needed for economic growth, the right kinds of policies aren't going to happen. So, that's part of the challenges we've got to, with regard to the Ramsar site in particular, we've got to convince governments and corporations that wetlands are really important in order for them to maintain their businesses, to maintain good governance, to maintain water supplies for people, etc., etc. They need to understand what the values are, and they need to understand what it is that's happening that's decreasing the ability of wetlands to provide these services that are actually vitally important to maintaining the economy and maintaining human well-being. So just move on to the next slide, please. So here we've got a couple of other reinforcing feedbacks, which just show you about how reinforcing feedback can either lead to good governance or bad governance. So on the left-hand side, we've got weak democracy, denial of rights, and corruption, which leads to depletion or denial of access to resources, which leads to poverty, conflict, and political violence. So that's a really serious, vicious cycle leading to systemic collapse. And we see that often in ecosystems because people who live in ecosystems, who make decisions about ecosystems on a day-to-day basis, they don't have the rights that they need to manage those lands and manage those ecosystems properly. There's a lot of people from outside who say, oh no, we know better than you. We think you need to do this, this, and this. And because they don't know, because they don't understand what the people on the ground understand, they don't have that local perspective, it tends to lead to all kinds of governance problems. And people eventually get fed up with being told what to do and they rebel. So it doesn't work. So then on the right, we've got exactly the same kind of reinforcing loop, but it operates in the opposite direction. Strong democracy, lots of stakeholder participation, affirmation of stakeholders' rights so that they know they've got a genuine stake in the system. They've got a genuine voice in deciding how it's going to be used. They have equitable access to resources. Then you get peace and well-being, and so you get this virtuous cycle of good ecosystem governance and things like Ramsar wetlands. If this kind of system is put in place, this kind of governance system is put in place, then those Ramsar wetland systems can thrive, survive, and continue to provide the services that people so desperately need. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a diagram straight out of a paper on applying resilient science to governance problems. And what it shows is that when you want to change a system, you need to have two sets of things happening. So if you look at the right-hand side of this diagram, you see the big omega in an orange square, or a pink square perhaps. Okay, and there are two things that happen there which lead to that omega state, or the state of system collapse. One is at the level of authority, large-scale interactions, where governments, et cetera, lose their capacity to provide the leadership and maintain a system in the status quo state. All right, so that's the one side of it. And at the other side, you get these small-scale interactions where civil society is saying, no, we've got to change. This isn't serving us well. We're tired of being told what to do. We're tired of living like poor people. We're tired of watching our resources being drained away by bad governance. So that sets the stage for the collapse, and then enables some kind of recovery, renewal, redesign of the system. So if you go to the left side of the system, where you've got that alpha sign and the green square, that is the window of opportunity for creating change. Right. So there, the large scale interactions, you get governance and politics and financial and elections and things. All those things can be used to create the system in response to the small scale interactions, as individual leadership, social capital, and those kinds of things that come together to create a new kind of governance system for whatever system it is that you're trying to manage. Now, this model is valid for any system at any level of scale, and in a sense, it doesn't tell us anything that we don't already know. We know that systems collapse. We know that governance systems collapse. We know that people revolt to bring about collapse in governance systems. These collapses often happen in relation to things like food shortages. So you get this synergistic interaction with people who are unhappy anyway, and then there's a food shortage, and that pushes them over the edge. But what systems thinking does is it enables us to see more clearly through the complexity and take relative, or in some cases very complex situations, and present them in ways that it makes it easier to understand what are the dynamics. And with an understanding of the dynamics, then we can step in and say, okay, these are the kinds of things that we want to change. So these different, this panicky model on governance change, and the feedback loop models, and the iceberg model, they all help us to think about what is going on in our system, and what kinds of intervention do we need to apply to change it. Just going back to what Liette was saying about Ramsar, her last question was, can conservation organizations change the system? And I think the answer is, on their own, no, they can't. But they can work with other people, particularly political activists, and people who do recognize the value of wetlands, to put pressure on the larger scale systems that actually control the way the system operates, and control and dominate the governance of it, to create the necessary change. So yes, it can happen, but conservationists on their own, they need partners to work with to do it. And I will stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Great, thank you very much. And so we were able to do flip and flop and pretty well in some way.
Yeah, okay.
That's great. So I guess now, how do we go for question, discussion, comments?
There's 3 questions in the chat.
Okay.
One says, thank you, Liette, very much for an interesting presentation. And then there's a Dr. Sven Stadman TNFD might be a pathway to help business understand their effect and reliance on healthy ecosystems. I don't know what TNFD is. Maybe Sven can speak and put his question to us. Then there was one from Rosa about virtuous cycles and balancing loops, which I can respond to.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, excellent, it's working. Hey, first of all, thank you for this excellent and really interesting presentation. And and thanks for giving me the opportunity to raise a question. So just for giving you a bit of background, I'm working in management consulting in the private sector, and I've come to realize that the 2 main issues that companies are facing when they are trying or not trying to act on biodiversity losses, they only think about either regulatory compliance or return on investment. So there's no space for charity in there, unfortunately. And I think these are like the 2 access points that we need to look at. So how can we enforce regulatory compliance and also help them understand their effect that they have on nature, and also what risks and nature-related risks they have. And this is why I come to TNFD, which is called Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, to which IUCN is a knowledge partner. And this organization or this initiative basically assesses nature for nature-related risks that they risks that exist due to ecosystem collapse for businesses. So what is the effect of an ecosystem collapse or decline on a business, to help them understand like also the financial risk, because this is unfortunately like the only language that in the current system that we are living in, these businesses understand. So I just wanted to put this forward for discussion. Thank you very much.
This is quite interesting. Yeah, the issue of risk, and often, unfortunately, large corporations think that if they cannot find one material or some resource in one place, they can just move to another place. Is that considered in your case? Or because I'm thinking about, we had discussion in another forum about lithium, for example, which is important for batteries, and that now people are opening lithium mines a bit everywhere, in some cases displacing people. Just because they cannot find in one place, they go to another place.
Well, yeah, to my understanding, like the TNFD framework is actually, it's still in an early version, so it's currently in development, but it is supposed to be incorporated into sustainability reporting. So also like at EU level, when companies are reporting on their sustainability efforts, TNFD or similar frameworks will eventually become a part of the regulatory compliance process, because this is how the current efforts are being made to basically capture the businesses. Like, so again, thinking about both regulatory compliance and return on investment, putting the legal pressure on the companies to act. And yeah, so I hope this is like a pathway forward. But I'm really happy to keep in touch with you on these issues. And I'm actually quite a new member to the CEM, so I just joined like 2 months ago for the new quadrennial period. And yeah, perhaps we can do something about it and make things a little better.
Yeah, Sven, if I can just add to that, you know, I've worked with business in one way or another in my career, and one of the things is that by and large they're blind to what goes on in ecosystems and what biodiversity.
Absolutely.
So yeah. So partly then it's an educational issue, at least for people who are responsible for doing the risk assessment. I remember talking to a guy at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. He'd come in to be part of a working group on ecosystem services, and he was absolutely clueless. I mean, he's a very competent guy, a very bright guy. It wasn't part of his knowledge. Yeah. And I think that's a problem with the business world in general. Then and that can be overcome if people are willing to learn about ecosystems and how the things that ecosystems produce are important to their business. Then the other thing is the investment side of it. Now, the problem is that people who invest, they expect a return, they expect a profit. And it's that expectation of profit and the interest rates set by banks, for example, that make it very difficult for businesses to find sustainable ways of using ecosystems without breaking them. And it actually goes back to the way the finance sector works, and the fact that the banks don't loan you money that they've got. They create money by entering by entering a loan in a register against whatever assets the borrower might have. So we've got this really crazy financial system which undermines or underlies all of it, and it means that in order to protect their financial risk, banks are not going to let go on their interest rates, and they're not going to let go on debt. So a company that wants to maintain viability has to be sure that it can repay its loans and meet its debt obligations, which means that it has to exploit the environment. There's no way around it, to some extent or other. And so that's one of those really fundamental changes that has to happen within Western and industrial societies. We've got to find a better way of using money and for banks to make money available without pushing companies to the point and individuals to the point where they have to overuse nature. So that's that side of it. Then on the risk assessment side, actually resilience assessments itself provide a really good way of assessing risk. On the ecosystem side, you need somebody who understands financial risk to work with somebody who understands ecosystems and ecosystem collapse and the kinds of things that can go wrong, the kinds of changes that might be happening within a system that put it into a state where it's at risk of collapse. Somebody like that to work with people from the financial sector to come up with at least something that's approaching sustainability.
Yes, fully agree. Sorry, I don't want to take up all the time. I'm sure there are
but
other
I mean,
questions,
it's a really good question, and it's fundamental to our future.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, and one thing that I actually might would like to add is like from the current legislation, I think the aspect of biodiversity is still a few years behind the aspects of climate change in current legislation, because all the businesses I'm currently talking to, they're all talking about decarbonization, and even there, they're just getting their heads around it. And the problem is that they still don't see this other topic. And I think what's currently happening, there are some access points that are like currently happening. For instance, there are some banks and initiatives that are giving like special subsidies to green investments. But this won't be enough, I think, for like a fundamental change of the system, as Mike proposes, and I think which is also what I think would be required. But yeah, I think this is also something that we need to think about, is like to actually more emphasize the aspect of biodiversity, and not just saying like this is like 10 years behind climate change in their developments, but it's just like happening in parallel right now and requires just as much as attention as the other issue.
Yeah, and this is why I should say at CEM we're trying to really push that people make the link that, and this is why we're based on the ecosystem approach, because biodiversity is interlinked, if you want, with climate change. If you cannot separate, you cannot put that in two different boxes and thinking they don't interact. And that's the scary part right now that we have, is probably that people don't necessarily understand that.
Yes.
So I think we have a question from Rosa. So thank you very much, Sam, for.
Thank you too. It was really nice meeting you. Nice
meeting you too. So we have Rosa, who put the question: how can system change be done with the current international law? How to change it? So how to change the public international law? I don't know if Rosa, you want to explain a little bit more what you wanted to say.
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, no. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. It's like there is like this set of convention that you were mentioning at the international level. I don't quite understand, or what do you mean by voluntary, as in Ransom Convention, contrary to the other conventions, as Convention of Biological Diversity, that is like more strong regarding its application at the national level. But in general, countries has the possibility to follow or not the decision taken at the international level in the framework of international law, public international law. So how can we change this framework of public international law? It is possible or not? Because finally, this is public, but there's the public international law, there's also private international law. How can we change these two set of rules that control the globalization process, and finally affect what happens in the ground at the national and local level? So this idea of ecocide and this kind of ideas that were put by people at the international level, but if it's possible, like to introduce this idea of ecocide as a crime against humanity, this will give more strength to the application at the
sorry. The system is
okay. I finish.
Oh, okay. Something happened. Oh, yeah. In fact, most of the convention do not have necessarily legal obligation for the countries. Even if you look at the Aichi target, this is why it's the same with the SDGs. It's a promise in some way, but it's not necessarily that they have to, and they will be legally charged if they don't do it. So that's the big challenge with the Ramsar Convention. It is the same with most of these conventions. There are no legal requirement, if you want, for the people to put the to necessarily have the the
The
capacity.
strength, well, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's really
Mm.
depending. And this is why some countries may, they may sign the convention, but then will not necessarily do
Mhm.
anything depending on what they want. And also the capacity of some of these countries. So this is
Mm.
why it's always complicated. It's not something that is straightforward, as we can say.
Yeah, but do you think strengthening the international law will be something that could happen to change, or it's useless to focus on at that global level of changing this way of handling global challenges with law, or is
Yeah.
useless? I
Yeah.
just
No, I think ecocide, it's still a social movement for change to create the crime of ecocide as one of the crimes against peace. And it's a very interesting initiative, and it is gaining momentum. If they are successful, then what it means is that individual heads of governments and individual heads of corporations can be tried in the International Criminal Court. Now, if that happens, that will make senior decision makers who have a lot of power, it will make them pay very serious attention to what their policies and actions are going to do. But we're a way away from that happening yet.
Yeah.
So until it does happen, I think we're really much more dependent on local civil society action and local stakeholders and people of good intent saying to government, hey, these policies are actually destroying our lives and livelihood. You need to change things so that we can protect the resources that we're dependent on.
Yeah, I understand that. I see that this local action of civil society putting pressure has its limits, because destruction continues. All the engagement are not done by at the national level by government. So something is missing.
Yeah, it's a complicated, and I think we'll never be able to resolve this issue. This is why we have discussed that this CEM dialogue, especially on the issue of governance and all that, will certainly continue it will become a series, I think, because there are many other components that can certainly can be integrated in that, and there are more. And I saw in the chat, in fact, sorry, my chat is not working fast.
Yeah, there's somebody called Jake Rice who's
Jake
posted a couple of really long messages in the chat. Maybe Jake would like to step up and pose a question. One was related to cities and the ability of local stakeholder action to alleviate problems with regard to cities.
Okay, Jake.
Thank you. And thanks for two very interesting presentations and some very good discussion. And it's interesting to see, I mean, I started working in this field on desert riparian land use planning in the 1970s and have gotten very old, gray, and worn out with these battles. And it's really important to keep these dialogues going. But at the end of the day, and I say this after 35 years and still as an emeritus, a scientist within government trying to make these changes real. It's one thing to believe the change is necessary and see the pathway. You have to put the evidence on the table that says these decisions that benefit this particular interest group, which we represent, do not come at the cost of other Canadians or other citizens who have different values. I've been on 2 IPCC assessments, and I'm just finishing my second IPBES assessment, their sustainable use assessment. I co-chaired the Americas assessment. I've been on 2 world ocean assessments, trying to put the evidence together that there are pathways forward. There are no win-win choices for every ideology on the planet. But there are ways forward that see us deal with the very urgent needs of biodiversity without marginalizing the people in urban areas who will not understand how they benefit from more protection for our really important Ramsar sites. They won't, just like to some of us, it's incomprehensible that part of the discussion of the appropriate reaction of the rest of the world to the Russian invasion of the Ukraine is talking about what different ways to deal with these crises will mean for the price of gasoline at the pump. We haven't yet reached a position as a society to deal with issues solely on principle, even though many of us wish, and I put myself in the us, wish we could make decisions based on principle. We have to have the evidence of the costs to the whole planet, not just to the local sites of the alternatives on the table. If we expect to get elected governance, which represents, even in Canada, there are more seats won and lost on urban issues than issues of rural areas and the areas where we still have more intact and integral nature. These are really much harder governance challenges to actually make a difference on than I was picking up in a lot of the discussion we've had. We can talk about the ideology over a beer for the rest of the day. But if we really want to make a difference, we have to start thinking about what is it we can offer to the people who are going to pay the costs, who are going to feel they're paying the short-term costs for the benefits we say the planet has to have. And if we can't show them why people who live in urban areas and as long as they've got a cottage for 2 weeks in the summer, that's all that matters with nature. We have to put something on the table for everybody, not just for each other.
Yeah, it's a good point. And there are more. This is a big thing, and we have been saying that in another forum, how important education and bring things really to the ground. It's not just high in the sky that we have to deal with that. It's really complicated. I know we are over time a bit, and we still have one question. So it's okay, Mike, for one more question?
Yeah, I'm good for another question.
Okay, so
yeah, I'd like to respond to Jake, but maybe another day.
Yeah, so you can respond a bit, and I really think we'll need to have a series of these discussions.
Yeah, I mean,
think we just started.
not to diminish anything that he said. It's a well-known problem. Just one aspect of it is to demonstrate to people that change doesn't necessarily cost them, that there are actually beneficial sides to changing the way we do things. So that's just one very quick response to that.
Good. And I think, Mariana, you had your hand up.
Yeah, there's a question from Arthur Dahl in the proper place in the Q&A box.
Okay. Oh, okay.
I don't know.
Okay, now I can see it. I was trying to check the other one.
Sorry, my microphone isn't working very well. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks. Yeah, I put my question in the chat box. It's a bit of a personal question, but I wanted to know, in your perspective, where do you think we can have the biggest impact? Because I've been in science, I've been in communication, I've been in public policy, I've been in all of that, and I've always somehow ended up frustrated, feeling like they're like sometimes governments and companies and as you said, internal law is very much up to will. So where do you think we can have the biggest impact to change?
Oh, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it?
Yeah,
and I think the answer is really quite personal, because it depends on you and your strengths and what you think is really important to you. And if you go with that and what makes your heart feel good, then you're probably likely to have impact. If you're just doing something because you think it might be the right thing to do, but your heart's not in it, then you're not going to have a lot of impact. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I push systems thinking, because for me, systems thinking enables us to get a better understanding of the problems that we're dealing with. But, you know, that's me.
Yeah, and the complexity of the problems that people cannot just put a check beside it and it's done. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just read the one from Arthur in the Q&A. So while waiting for stronger global environmental governance, can we put pressures on corporation to write social and environmental responsibility into their corporate charters, for which they can be held legally responsible? That's, I think, another $60 million question, I would say. I know that I've been interacting with some of these large corporations to present on the environment and all of that. Interestingly enough, there's Global Alliance that is interacting to see how that can happen. But I think in some cases, they are trying to put social corporate responsibility as an interest for them. But at the same time, and I know we discussed that before in another forum, the question of greenwashing. And that's the big challenge that I think we'll have. But I think we'll need to probably bring other people on the dialogue at some point to talk about these things, especially related to large corporations.
And one thing about large corporations is that they are responsive to their shareholders. So if shareholders know what's going on and recognize that what the company's doing is not in their interest, then they will put pressure. But it gets back to that same problem of how do you make shareholders aware of what they're doing and its negative impacts on the environment. So it's possible. There's also possible with certain consumer items, for instance, that social activism can start boycotting the purchase of certain things, and that can lead to change maybe in a corporation or two. But it's, you know, it's not getting us to the big changes that we need in terms of the way we use our economy and our economic thinking to mediate the relationship between ourselves as humans and the rest of nature. We just our economic theories and our economic models are just not up to the job, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I think we can go further. I know I'm seeing a lot of very interesting components in the chat. I think it's really brought a lot of potential discussion for the future of CEM dialogues, and we'll certainly try to organize. We're not forgetting your names beside. We see them, so we'll certainly be able to gradually make possible new invitation and to be able to to continue the discussion and probably bring from different angles. Today we wanted to bring from the angles of the convention and RenzoSITEs, for example, as for helping to put that in perspective. But I think there's certainly the question of the large corporation, the question also of and I like Jake with the issue of generational challenges. Intergeneration discussion can be quite important as well. So we have, I think, a lot of possible new topics that we can certainly go further with that. And so thank you very much all for being here today. And we'll certainly continue to go at it. I believe that Mariana will be sending you an invitation for the next series of CEM dialogues. So thank you again for all being here today.
Yeah, thanks very much, and look forward to the next one. Bye.
Bye.